Professor Wang, Professor Leung, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mok Hing Yiu Lecture today. May I invite Professor Leung Yun Sang, Faculty Dean of Arts, to deliver a welcoming address. Professor Leung, please.
Well, good afternoon, Professor Fogg, Professor Wang, and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, I think, in this raining day, I think, coming to our distinguished public lecture by our Mok Hing Yiu visiting professor, Professor Der-wei Wang from Harvard University, who delivered, I think, yesterday, I think, the first lecture, and today is the last lecture, I think, for this distinguished public lecture series. Professor Wang David, yesterday, I think he talked about 思辨语, 思行, and today's lecture will be delivered in English. And the Mok Hing Yiu Lecture is made possible with the generous donation from the Mok Hing Yiu Charitable Foundation and the Mok family in memory of the late Dr. Mok Hing Yiu. On an annual basis, one widely acclaimed scholar will be invited to the Chinese University of Hong Kong for scholastic exchange and to advance teaching, research, and academic development of CHK. This year, we are very pleased to have invited Professor Der-wei Wang David from Harvard, who is Edward E. Henderson Professor of Chinese Literature. And Professor Wang is a well-renowned scholar in Chinese literature, Chinese culture, and maybe many other fields. Who received his university education in Taiwan, and his PhD, his master, and also PhD from the University of Wisconsin in medicine. He taught at Taida and Columbia University before taking up the current teaching position at Harvard University in 2004. I think maybe when we lured, I think, Professor Liu Li, I think, to come to Hong Kong, I think he replaced him. He published, I think, on a wide range of subjects in modern Chinese literature, comparative literature, and also cultural studies in both English and Chinese. So yesterday, he delivered his first lecture in Putonghua on 思辨 and 思行 to a very engaging, I think, very responsive, and very I think quite stimulated audience of over 200. And today his lecture will be in English, entitled Wording Literary China, Literary History, Modernity in Hong Kong. His lecture will take up approximately about an hour, and then leaving due half an hour, like 30 minutes for Q&A. So without much ado, now please join me in welcoming Professor Der-wei Wang on this lecture.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is indeed a great honor and a pleasure for me to visit the Chinese University of Hong Kong at this time. Let me just first take this opportunity to thank Dean Leung's invitation, and I want to thank, of course, each and every of you for being here, knowing the fact that this is not very pleasant weather at this moment, but certainly it's great to see everybody here, and I would like to use the next 60 minutes to share with you some discoveries of my recent project, which is a literary history about modern Chinese literary and cultural dynamics, a project I just finished, and certainly I would like to take this time to describe the conceptual framework, the discursive strategy, and perhaps the pedagogical assumption of a project like this. But still, I feel really this is a wonderful and exciting moment, particularly to see my predecessor at Harvard, Professor Leo Lee, being in the audience. And I benefited a lot from Leo's scholarship and friendship, certainly. This is also a lecture in honor of Leo's legacy at Harvard. My lecture will be divided into two parts. In the first part, I would like to give you a general picture about what I've been doing with regard to this project, a Harvard New Literary History of Modern China. And I will talk about why I was engaged in this project and what kind of methodology I would like to try out, to take up, to engage with the current paradigm of the reading and the writing of literary history. And in the second part of the lecture, I would like to give you some examples drawn from this project, particularly in relevance to Hong Kong, and who are involved in this project, and what kind of topics I have chosen to deal with in this volume on the cultural and the literary dynamics of Chinese literature over the past 100 years, and so on and so forth. So to begin with, the fundamental question I would like to raise is about what is literary history. I think for the guests in the audience, particularly those who are affiliated with the Chinese department, particularly in modern Chinese literary studies, we are probably all familiar with the current paradigm of reading and writing modern Chinese literary history. Normally, we start with Lu Xun, and following that line, we have Lu Guo Mao, Ba Lao Cao, Ba Jin, and so on and so forth. We have a grand narrative, normally starting with the Big Bang of the May 4th movement, and then history moved on in a linear fashion, one revolution after another, to the point where Hong Kong was finally returning to Mother China's embrace, and so on and so forth. In this kind of literary history, usually we come across a coherent narrative which features canonical works and figures, which usually introduce to us a series of so-called masterpieces, which usually highlights notable events, particularly events of political relevance. And usually we are suggested to read literary works in correspondence to the goings-on of historical dynamics along the historical line. And finally, we are supposed to draw some kind of an allegory, if not analogy, between literary development and national building. And this national characteristic, as reflected by national literary history, is usually regarded as a norm when we are given a piece of literary history to read, to consider. And as a teacher, I'm supposed to teach my students to look into the so-called Chinese-ness in each and every piece of literary works being featured in such kind of a history, or the so-called Chinese national character. And above all, we are all trying to figure out, trying to describe some kind of a zeitgeist of such a kind of a grand narrative in correspondence to the development of national history. So the nation and the narrating the nation in the format of a literary history is something we are used to. Particularly after 1949, when the new regime came to power, it was really intriguing to see a fact that is, although literature wasn't really occupying the center stage of national politics, the reading and writing of literary history, however, was taken as an extremely important matter. literary history has been produced in an enormous way, hundreds of thousands, actually, volumes of literary history, either pre-modern Chinese literature or particularly modern and contemporary Chinese literature. All sorts of volumes have been produced. And my colleagues in the PRC normally try very hard to come up their own versions or editions of literary history, as if one's scholarship or even integrity can be testified by such a kind of establishment of writing a huge volume of literary history. What I'm doing here, however, is something different. I'm trying to argue that literary history doesn't have to be understood or being compiled in such a kind of grand format of narrative. And with this concept in my mind, I accepted an invitation of the Harvard University Press a few years ago to edit a new, so-called new literary history of modern China. It took me 3 years to complete this project, and as I mentioned early on, I just finished this project 2 months ago, and so probably this is a moment for me to reflect upon the project as a whole, either conceptually or methodologically, and certainly I welcome your feedback at the end of my lecture. In this particular version of modern Chinese literary history, I seek to explore new ways to engage the roots and ramifications of modern Chinese cultural and literary dynamics. And it proposes that we rethink issues such as the periodization of modern. So all those terms that we have taken for granted now have to be re-examined or rethought of in this new project. And what constitutes literature? What do we make of this notion of literature? Or what is literary history? Questions like this, I thought, should be raised so as for us to re-engage with a new and a different format of understanding the whole project that is literary history as such. And above all, what constitutes modern Chinese literary history? So in this particular sense, I have tried to argue that we don't necessarily need a kind of a grand narrative to feature a very coherent sequence of events or character or movements or encounters. Instead, I am composing, so to speak, a kind of a constellation of different events, encounters, figures, movements, or sort of a momentary spur of feelings. And in such a way as to contribute to this already established continuum of Chinese literary history, a different kind of, and sometimes a very kaleidoscopic kind of view of how things have developed in this genre we call the literary history. So basically, two sort of formulaic lines for me to follow. On the one hand, I try to highlight the so-called pointillism of the chronicle. This is a history which actually follows some kind of a chronological line from some point of history of the past, and projected toward some future moment of the development of Chinese literary writing and composition. And in that sense, actually, this volume starts as early as 1635, when a late Ming Confucian scholar come Catholic convert named Yang Tingyun took up the idea of literature in a way reminiscent of what we eventually came to think what constitute literature as we understand today. So basically, that was a kind of imaginary beginning point when literature, now with quotation marks, was first taken up by a classical or traditional literatus in resonance to what we would eventually regard as literature with quotation marks in Western sense. So this is, for me, a kind of a moment to re-examine the beginning with quotation marks, again, the origins of literature. And this literary history ends in the year of 2066. That's 51 years from now. And we are told by a PRC science fiction writer that at that time, Martians are coming to this world, 火星人, and Martians are going to take over not only America, the evil empire, but also China, the benign empire. And actually, the whole global civilization will be exploded at the moment when the Martians are landed on the Earth. But worse than that, a kind of intelligence, a kind of artificial intelligence called Amando actually was even outsmarting the Martians, eventually taking over civilization, whether human civilization or extraterrestrial civilization altogether. So that's the kind of literary quality I try to bring back to our imagination of what may happen in the future. So here, what is history has become a new question for us to think about, particularly in terms of, say, an imaginary encounter with the past and with the future. Let me also mention that on the note of pointillism, I also wanted to argue that I want to put together actually a group of entry points marked by dates, marked by specific spatial sites, marked by specific human encounters. Through these points of reference, we enter a very complex world in which all kinds of literary impulses, imaginary forces are interplaying with each other. So besides what I mentioned, the Lu Xun, Mao Dun, Ba Jin, they ought to be there, but they ought to be there now in a different kind of profiles. I also have introduced to this literary history examples such as Dr. Sun Yat-sen's presidential speech and Chairman Mao's sort of a national declaration on the eve of the 1949 communist takeover of the mainland. This kind of a public announcement somehow, for me, took upon some kind of, imaginary calling upon the building or rebuilding of a nation. And on the other hand, in this new literary history, I have also included Teresa Deng Lijun. At one point, we all remember she was that little Deng who was outpowering the old Deng, Lao Deng, right? And she was capturing the imagination of one whole generation of PRC citizens in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. I also have Cui Jian in this literary history, knowing the fact that there hasn't been any so-called legal publication of literary works in commemoration of the Tiananmen incident. We somehow have an example of Cui Jian, who on one afternoon of May 1989 came to the Tiananmen Square singing together with more than 1 million of demonstrators and hunger strikers the song, 一无所有, nothing to me. I thought at that particular moment, through the lyrics of that song, through this sonic communication of those demonstrators right on the square, there was some kind of a new literature being called forth. And this is the kind of literature we should take note of. So I also have many other examples. For example, I have Lin Juemin. I think probably my audience knows who he is, and 语气诀别书. Before he joined the revolution action early that year, 1911, in the spring, he wrote this powerful farewell letter to his wife. I thought the letter can be accounted for as kind of a literary manifestation. On the other hand, Lin Zhao 的学术, Lin Zhao, probably most people here don't know who she is or who she was. In 1965, right on the eve of the Cultural Revolution, Lin Zhao, a woman political activist, Beida alum, who had been jailed for more than 8 years, used her own blood to write her protest against the regime on her stained shirt. And just a few weeks after her 学书 writing, she, of course, was executed. And her family was asked to pay for the bullet fee, 子弹费, and so on and so forth. So here, this is truly a kind of corporeal demonstration of the power of writing and inscription. And with her own life, Lin Zhao wrote to bear witness to the power of writing. And this kind of literature should also be understood and memorized by readers of this new version of literature. And therefore, from traditional textual, this kind of textual evidence to audio-visual evidence, even to digital representation of Chinese imaginations and imaginaries, my imagination of this new literary history should be medially very provocative. It should point to various moments of Chinese encounter with different kind of communicational technologies. And therefore, this is a kind of literature history that has to be relevant not necessarily to historical or political movement, but also to the everyday life of a practice in terms of the day-to-day sort of technical or technological management of our lived experience. And above all, this is a literary history which has to be literary. We otherwise have read too many literary history. The narrative is so boring, so dry, right? I think we all have had this experience reading literary history and falling asleep. And therefore, on that note, I've invited Ha Jin, the renowned Anglophone writer, to write about 1918, April, I'm trying again, 1918, May 2nd, 1918. On that night, a gentleman in Beijing named Zhou Shuren, or Lu Xun, who just had an inspiration to write down something at the encouragement of his friend Qian Xuantong, and the result was 狂人日记, Diary of a Madman. So I suggest to Ha Jin to write a piece of a story, and he did. So the birth of the Diary of the Madman, that particular topic was written by a writer who literally recreated this moment of creation of modern Chinese literature. So all these ideas brought me to a new kind of sort of horizons of understanding how several generations of Chinese literati and intellectuals in a row through the 20th century have engaged in this enterprise we now call literature. And literature shouldn't be just a subject matter for classroom study or research. Literature should be something which happens to all of us, which engage us in different kind of ways. But for those who are curious about this kind of project, particularly colleagues who would probably accuse me of playing with this trick of a postmodernist anarchy or a kind of a carnival, right? This seems to, my project seems to go all kind of directions, trying to just grab something exciting or weird to impress, embarrass, or shock readers and so on and so forth. I don't think so. I think I have my theoretical engagement with my new project. And this theoretical engagement doesn't have to be inspired merely by Western theoretical models. I've thought about these models. Probably we can easily call such a kind of formulation of literary history in terms of Walter Benjamin's constellation, or Deleuze's assemblage or fold, or Mikhail Bakhtin's heteroglossia. All these terms come to my mind when we are looking at a kind of presentation of different voices, viewpoints, and soundings in contestation. It seems to us there has been a kind of theoretical discourse to follow. But for me, we probably also want to think of inspirations drawn from classical Chinese literary sources. And as I mentioned yesterday in my first talk, I wanted to call attention to the Chinese engagement with the concept of wen. It's difficult to translate this particular character, but nevertheless, I thought this idea of wen certainly has inspired hundreds and thousands of intellectuals over all the dynasties in pre-modern China. And this particular concept of wen is actually still inhabiting our cultures even to date. For me, this 文学的文 refers to, epistemologically speaking, first to the pattern, a kind of ornament, a kind of embellishment, a kind of design, a sign. And this one is also kind of an inscription, is a kind of script, not just a linguistic script, but also inscription in all kinds of artistic and aesthetic senses. And this one can be understood as a particular form of a scholarship. 文章, 学问 is a kind of learning. In Han Dynasty, 文章 actually refers to a particular governmental position, referring to someone who specializes in a certain kind of a knowledge. But then in medieval China, this wen was taken to bear upon the whole endeavor of aesthetic forms of writing. And here, for the first time, we come to terms with this artistic and aesthetic cultivation of language in terms of wen. And this is probably a definition closest to our understanding of 文学的文 even today. But beyond that, wen also refers to a kind of upbringing, refer to a kind of a cultural ambiance, a kind of a humor or disposition, 文化气质. And above all, this wen refers to a civilization. It refers to the wholesome and overall manifestation of Chinese encounters with all kinds of humanistic engagements. So I would like to revive this understanding of wen in traditional sense in the modern and the contemporary context, knowing nevertheless the fact that we are already in a modern and a modernized condition. So probably how to bring the two sources, the 文学的文, the literature in modern Western definition, and the 文学的文 in classical traditional sense, bring them together to really tease out the similarities and the dissimilarities, and coming to terms with a new kind of a definition of a 文 and the 文学 and the 文学史. That probably is something I would like to engage in. So here, just to repeat what I said, wen points to a multitude of artifacts, locations, or encounters that manifest the world over time. Wen is not a sign so much as an articulation of the meaning of the world through a set of correlating ideas, objects, or doings. And in this sense, I just want to argue that this particular 文学 has to be historicized. And in our context, in modern sense, this 现代文学 has to be understood, has its own life cycle, has its own kind of sort of a heritage and consequences. So what do we know? How much do we know about this 文学 in the modern sense? And here I gave two dates. Actually, there is one entry which was written by a colleague from Hong Kong, Professor Leonard Chen of the 教育学院, the Institute of Education. 1902, for the first time, 文学 was being foregrounded as one of the subjects in the recently reformed curriculum of Beijing University, or 京师大学堂 at that time. In 1904, 文学史, literary history, was for the first time being composed by a young teacher of 京师大学堂, Lin Chuanjia. In the meantime, a professor based in Suzhou, 东吴大学, Huang Ren, came up with another edition of literary history. So at that time, we are witnessing at that time a very sort of seminal forms of writings about the rises and the falls of literary history. So here, to repeat, for this generation of intellectual and writers, literature could be understood in a new and Western sense as a kind of fictitious representation of the world we are living in, or the world we are idealizing and projecting somewhere. But in traditional sense, literature could be understood as a kind of ongoing process of manifestation. That is, literature is a compilation of science and all kind of the human constructs being worked in such a way toward the goal of the manifestation of some kind of pattern of the world, the society, the world, or the cosmos. I try to bring these two different kind of knowledge systems together to examine the hiatuses, the lacuna, or the interstices, and not necessarily to smooth out the differences, but trying to really foreground the dialectic nature of Wen as a subject, as an engagement throughout the modern times. So that probably is the first thing I would like to call attention to. And now come to the second point of my project. That is, what is history? What is the literary history? And here, only one point to make. That is, literary history has its own roots only in the early hundreds of the 20th, early teens and the 1920s of the modern century. But poetry and history, the interrelationship between these two humanistic genres or categories has always been a subject that occupied the minds of pre-modern scholars. So how do we define and redefine the relationship between poetry and history, something for us to think about again? So here, in the interest of the time, I'm not going to read the wording on this page, but just want to highlight the fact I'm trying to call attention to the fact that for writers and intellectuals of early modern century, particularly writers such as Lu Xun, Hu Shi, Zheng Zhenduo, and so on and so forth, they all were trying to reconcile this concept of history on the one hand and literature or poetry on the other. And there were many, many moments, history and poetry, or in Chinese, shi and shi, are actually interchangeable. So how to bring out the nuance of literature as a kind of manifestation of historical engagement, something for us to think about. Ever since 1940s and 1920s, a lot of literary histories have been produced. Here, just a quick look at all these names. And generation after generation, Chinese intellectuals were really very much interested in producing different kind of a literary history. And particularly, as I said, after 1949, this is truly a cultural industry to speak of. We all have to write our own versions of literary history. But when I come to this, this is a CD shot. This is a very lonely Western version, in English, lonely version of History of Modern Chinese Fiction, which was first published in 1961. But ever since, we have yet to see another version of literary history in English. But for me, probably it's probably not the kind of a long and big history we really need anymore, or I personally wanted to engage in anymore. I want to do something different, and that's why I'm here to introduce this different kind of history. I have invited more than 143 authors as contributors to this project. And the result is a total of 158 158 essays, each as long as 2,000 words. So this is truly a huge sort of collaborative project with multiple perspectives, voices, and styles. And some of my colleagues here in the audience are also part of the project, Lawrence Wang, Shen Shuang, Liu Li, and so on and so forth. So we wanted to really put together in a way, a kind of a glossia of viewpoints and voices and discourses styles to showcase the manifold features of Chinese literary experience. That's probably what I want to talk about in terms of the concept of rewriting history in literary terms. And finally, what is China? And I know this is a contentious kind of a thorny kind of issue, particularly at this moment. But let me just say that in this particular anthology, I want to say China can be understood as a historical process, or as a cultural and intellectual lineage, or as a political entity, or as just merely an imagined community. China as an equivalent to a political sovereignty was something which was invented as late as early 20th century. And when China was identified with the Republic of China or People's Republic of China, really we are just talking about a rather recent history of this whole Chineseness business. And the Qing dynasty or Ming dynasty and other dynasties, each period had its own way to define this Chineseness. Scholars from Xu Zhuoyun to Ge Zhaoguang have told us again and again that this particular understanding of China has to be carefully examined and understood in the historical light. And for me, this kind of a new literary history of a modern China provides yet another platform through which to rethink the multiple meanings and the dimensions of thinking and imagining China. And to end this section, I just want to throw in one more key word. That is the title of today's lecture, Worlding Literary China. This is a bizarre word, and actually, worlding for me is this is just a kind of a happy encounter. As you could tell from this, the screen, worlding is a term originally coined by Martin Heidegger, so a little bit of philosophical touch here. By turning the noun world into an active verb, Heidegger calls attention to the way in which the world is constructed and exists eternally in a constantly shifting state of becoming. So basically, we're talking about a process of becoming, of how, as human beings living in this world, in this kind of a condition of existence, how we engage the meanings continuously generated by our encounter with stimuli around us. Worlding is a complex and a dynamic process of ever-renewing realities, sensations, and perceptions, through which one incessantly works to access the open of the world. This is, of course, a kind of jargon here. In recent years, worlding has been used by colleagues in Western academia to refer to the concept of a global or international. Let me say this is a beautiful mistake because Heidegger could have never imagined worlding as either global, 全球, or international, or 国际. It's not what Heidegger meant to begin with. But in recent years, people started to expand the meaning of worlding to mean different kind of things, but which is all right because we are in the business of language. We are inventing and reinventing the meaning of a certain the expression or phrase. But for me, this concept, this Heideggerian concept of worlding is interesting because it could probably be brought to bear upon the idea of a 文 or literariness I mentioned just now, knowing nevertheless the fact that these two concepts are very, very different in terms of philosophical backgrounds and historical contexts. Still, I think both approaches, either the Heideggerian understanding of a worlding or the traditional Chinese definition of a wen, shared this understanding that the language has to be understood as a kind of immanent vehicle through which meaning could be continuously constructed and reconstructed so as to generate a so-called unfolding of the ultimate sort of meaning of the world. But the difference, however, for Heidegger, this kind of a worlding is always progressing through the continuum of time and the temporality. But in the Chinese context, wen refers to a kind of entelechy of the manifestation of all kind of artistic and aesthetic and humanistic sort of constructs. So there are differences, but here probably we don't want to step into the further discussion. I want to get into the second part of my presentation. That is why modernity matters, and particularly why Hong Kong matters in my approach to this project. Here I give 4 different directions in terms of how I define the modernity in this project of modern Chinese literary history. The first is architectonics of temporalities. I think different kind of ideas of time and temporalities are necessary issues for us to think about, to engage with when we look at a project such as a new literary history of modern China. And secondly, I particularly focus upon the dynamics of travel and the transculturation, which again, for me, is something which characterizes the literary and cultural agencies of Chinese lecturers, literati, and intellectuals throughout the modern centuries. And thirdly, the contestation between the traditionally defined wen or literariness and the most up-to-date kind of engagement with mediality or the different kind of media. And finally, how do we, through literary writing and reading, configure and reconfigure a kind of literary cartography with regard to our understanding or our imagination of modern China. So basically, different kind of approaches to this very much contested concept of modernity. But let me just give some examples. Now I try to bring all the above discussions to a specific point. That is why Hong Kong matters in this project. I have sort of planted in different time zones in this literary history key moments, key figures. For me, very crucial, very crucial for our understanding of the formation of Chinese modernity. So my first group of examples has to do with the so-called the phenomenon of a translation or translated modernity. I'm referring to a group of missionaries and translators who are based or who were based in Hong Kong and who helped to bring this sort of Chinese experience into a global or international orbit. We are thinking of Robert Morrison. The time is 1807, September 6th. That's all the entries started with specific date. When Robert Morrison visited Guangzhou, only to be turned away because he was a foreigner, he was up to no good, he was trying to bring some kind of a bizarre religious message to innocent Chinese. So he was turned away and he was driven to Macau, and then eventually he moved to Hong Kong. And for the next decades, Robert Morrison traveled in Southeast Asia with Hong Kong as his hub. And he, however, engaged in a tremendous enterprise of translating biblical references, the Bible, and other sorts of materials. And as a result, he together with his colleagues, actually created a tremendous edifice we now have to describe as a kind of a translated sort of modern texts either in religious sense or in non-religious sense. And he actually is responsible for the dissemination of a kind of a vernacular language, 白话文, through this engagement between two different languages. So that's how I think of Hong Kong and a particular agent, right? Working together to create a different kind of sort of imagination of the genesis of Chinese literary modernity. We are also thinking of Wang Tao in the year 1862, October 11. He arrived in Hong Kong on that date. He was actually fleeing from Shanghai because he was being chased after due to his possible relationship to Taiping rebels. And Wang Tao was very unhappy when he came to Hong Kong because he really didn't want to leave home. And nevertheless, he had to spend the next 22 years in Hong Kong working with James Leake and translating a multitude of Chinese classics into English. And this again represented that marvelous moment when a traditional Chinese literatus now equipped with a foreign language, in his case, English. And he was able to communicate with both Chinese and non-Chinese, and creating a different kind of a system of knowledge called the translational Chinese system. And here, again, I think Wang Tao, his contribution is truly on no small scale when we look back at the dynamics of the burgeoning moments of Chinese modernity. In the past, when we look at the Lei Qing literature, we usually denigrate Lei Qing as that decadent final moment of a good old Chinese tradition. But now, of course, we want to argue that the Lei Qing represents actually a very important beginning moment of Chinese literary modernity. Or we can think of Sir Thomas Wade. 1873, June 29th, Thomas Wade has a kind of imperial audience with Emperor Tongzhi Tongzhi Huangdi in Beijing. And that was the important moment because the audience resulted in the founding of Tongwenguan. That's the College of Translation or Bureau of Translation. It's now a kind of governmental office that marked the official beginning of Chinese engagement with foreign languages. And before he came to Beijing on June 29th, Thomas Wade had spent many years in Hong Kong. Actually, he was involved in different kind of translational activities and engagements in Hong Kong. And again, this translational and the transcultural identity of Hong Kong should be highlighted as China's first encounter with the world. This kind of experience has to be understood as starting with this particular place called Hong Kong. And some of my colleagues want to argue about colonial modernity, which is definitely making sense. But here, however, I want to argue that once we are talking about this kind of international circulation of language, information, and knowledge, and the politics definitely is extremely important, but there are some other dimensions for us to think about beyond colonial or post-colonial politics. So this is yet another entry which I featured in this new project. And finally, 1913 and 2011, two dates juxtaposing with each other. And here I refer to the date of a publication of a book of Da Tong Shu by Kang You-wei. And the story goes like this. Kang You-wei first visited Hong Kong in the year of 1879 when he was only 21 years old. And this experience, the first visit to Hong Kong, was an eye-opening experience. For the first time, he was exposed to a different kind of a sort of a world. Although this is a colonial site, Hong Kong, under the control of a different kind of a political power, and yet Kang You-wei came to realize a different kind of approach to China, actual different kind of perspective from which to understand the dynamics on the mainland. And in the next 20-some years, Kang You-wei came up with his utopia, 大同书. And this book was first published, the first 2 chapters of this book were first published in 1913. And the whole book was published in 1935. And then it was in the year 2011, a Hong Kong-born director, Evans Chen, took up this book again and made it into a docudrama. Evans Chen, Chen Yaocheng, and eventually we know 大同, this project developed to become a multimedia enterprise involving even an opera, which I had a chance to watch early this spring. So how Hong Kong intellectuals, literati, came to terms with the concept of Chinese utopia. Why at this historical moment of the year 2011, this Evans Chen suddenly remembered 大同, suddenly remembered this utopian sort of vision of a future China? Some kind of a historical linkage, some kind of a political implication seems to be hanging somewhere. So for us, this again, the juxtaposition of a different kind of dates and timelines projected onto a different kind of horizon of historical imagination. My second group of entries projected onto a different topic, different dimension of Hong Kong experience. I featured Fei Mu, who came to Hong Kong in the year 1949, one of the so-called Nanlai Wenren, the literati who moved southbound as a result of a political turmoil on the mainland. Before he came to Hong Kong, he had already made quite a number of very refined artistic movies, including Confucius. Right? And these movies eventually went into oblivion after 1949. It was in Hong Kong, the final destination of Fei Mu's adventure. In 1980s, his early films were gradually excavated. A different Fei Mu, a different kind of cinematic vision of Chinese modernity was being created by colleagues right in Hong Kong, including the masterpiece Xiaocheng Zhichun, The Spring of a Small Town. And Confucius, which was made in 1940, was also discovered very recently, just I think about 10, 15 years ago. I had a chance to watch it in 电影资料馆 in Hong Kong, and certainly amazing experience. So the question we want to ask is, in what sense? Why? In Hong Kong, we have a group of film scholars and critics and connoisseurs who were capable of appreciating the artfulness of this director, who otherwise would have been totally forgotten by our colleagues on the mainland for whatever reason. So what if we don't have the space called Hong Kong? What if we erase the site of Hong Kong? Then what would happen to the history, the literary history of modern China? Or think about Eileen Chang, of course, everybody's good friend, right? And she came to Hong Kong first time in 1939, and 1941, December 25th, Professor Leo Lee's date for Eileen Chang entry. And that day, of course, marked the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. And as a result of the occupation, Eileen Zhang had to suspend her coursework at Hong Kong U, and she was eventually driven into a very sort of desperate circumstance because she had no resources to live upon. Finally, she ended up working as a nurse in some kind of medical station during wartime Hong Kong. According to her, in her famous essay, 禁语录, right? She was the most irresponsible nurse in the world, right? And but somehow the Hong Kong experience inspired Eileen Chang, and in the spring of 1942, finally she had a chance to embark on an ocean liner back to Shanghai, and therefore started her literary career. So that was Eileen Chang and Hong Kong. And Hong Kong definitely was a source of her literary inspiration. All her most important works at the beginning of her career were in one way or another related to Hong Kong. And it's amazing that when Eileen Zhang was working as a very, very irresponsible nurse somewhere at some medical station, a woman writer from Manchuria was dying in another hospital, right? So the two of the most important writers in 20th century China actually were living in a way at almost at the same time at one particular moment. Here, I'm referring to January 22nd, 1942. Xiao Hong died that day in a hospital, all by herself, right? And we don't have to belabor the importance of Xiao Hong. What I want to mention here is that in the year of 2014, last fall, a film director named An Hui, Xu Anhua, and who was the daughter of a father from Manchuria, and we know her mother was Japanese. And she somehow managed to produce a very, very important film, 黄金时代. All right. This is, again, a kind of Hong Kong perspective through which to commemorate the life and the death of one of the most important writers in 20th century China from a unique feminine and feminist perspective. So how do we bring this to the different kind of moments of history together? How do we understand that through the tunnel of time, two women artists were able to have an imaginary dialogue? And this is what the literary history should do. And this is why Hong Kong is a place full of this kind of unlikely encounters. That's what I meant by this kind of imaginary aspect of literary history. And now the third group of writings which I feature in this literary history. I want to argue that after 1949, when the whole nation, the new nation, the People's Republic of China was founded, and when the whole national literature was being hegemonized by the new regime in terms of a realism, whatever you call it, the critical realism, eventually socialist realism, or romantic socialist realism in the romantic vein, and so on and so forth. It was first in Hong Kong that we witnessed a group of very young poets and fiction writers who somehow had different take upon what literature should be like or should be doing for the Chinese humanities in this kind of aftermath of national divide. I'm talking about William Yip, a poor Hong Kong student who somehow had this idea of writing something we call the 现代诗, modern or modernist poetry. And before William Yip came along, of course, there had been a tradition of Chinese modernism. Professor Liu Li wrote profusely on the project. But what I want to argue is that after 1949, when this whole modernist discourse and production suddenly came to a halt on the mainland, in Hong Kong, young poets, young writers suddenly sort of experiences this outburst of modernist imagination and inspiration. The result is truly an amazing sort of cornucopia of ideas, soundings, experimentations, first in Hong Kong, then gradually moving to Taiwan. It's in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and eventually Chinese-speaking communities in Southeast Asia, we come to realize that this modernist kind of impulse was able to carry on. And it would take another 3 decades for such a kind of modernist experimentation made its own way back to the mainland. William Yip, 1959, actually invited Professor Yip to write about his personal experience of being a young poet, writing obscure, ambiguous modernist poems in his formative years in Hong Kong. What if our literary history missed someone like Jin Yong, right? And I'm talking about the other sort of extreme in terms of a spectrum of literary experimentations in Hong Kong during the Cold War period. On the one hand, you have the modernist experimentations represented by William Yip. On the other hand, a journalistic person named Zha Liangyong or Jin Yong, who started to write a series of 武侠小说, chivalric romance. Year was 1956, and the result, a series of 16 novels, which truly generated an unlikely vision of cultural China, with quotation marks, however you want to define it. And in this chivalric utopia, a China, a cultural China, a China full of adventures, romances, and humanistic engagements somehow was surviving this otherwise incredible socialist regime or age. So even today, probably can still argue that Jin Yong is the most popular writer throughout 20th century. If our literary history has only Lu Xun, that would have been really boring, right? And luckily we got Jin Yong, and luckily even today, the youngest generation of Jin Yong fans were able to play the Jin Yong computer games. And that kind of literature, that kind of literary energy is still going on. That's why we salute Jin Yong for his contribution. And here, the entry point for me is the year 1967. That was the heyday of the Cultural Revolution. When Da Zibao and so on, that's another kind of literature, right? When Da Zibao was so being widely circulated on the mainland, a writer, Jin Yong, wrote Xiaoao Jianghu. Of course, we know it's a political allegory. And this is Jin Yong's response to the socialist politics. And I suppose today, when we talk about whatever kind of politics, whatever kind of democracy, socialist, or whatever, according to Wang Hui, the Cultural Revolution is the most democratic moment of Chinese history. We want to argue that Jin Yong probably has demonstrated to us a different kind of writing about and in democracy. So finally, what about Liu Yichang, another modernist writer? And we know in 1972-73, Liu Yichang wrote 对道, right? This is extremely mesmerizing and intriguing kind of experimentation with some narrative modernism. And somehow in the year 2000, Wong Kar-wai was inspired by Liu Yichang. And he ended up directing a movie. I think everybody must have seen the movie or watched the movie, 花样年华, In the Mood of Love. So how two Hong Kong artists engage in a kind of a dialogue in different kinds of genres, but somehow managed to use these two works to illuminate each other's visions. Hong Kong in the 1960s and Hong Kong in the new centuries. And what kind of mood of love are we talking about? And Wong Kar-wai's sort of nostalgic film is not just merely a movie about romance that was truncated in the period of late 1960s and early 1970s, but also this may as well be another kind of political allegory that alert us to Wong Kar-wai's engagement with a different kind of structure of feeling shared by Hong Kong people at the turn of the first century. So this is what I meant by another kind of sort of Hong Kong experience which managed to illuminate our understanding of the whole history of Chinese modernity. But we should never forget, now the third category, talking about icons, right? And again, during the Cultural Revolution period, when our compatriots, 祖国, 同胞, were celebrating Chairman Mao, somehow Hong Kong movie makers managed to produce a different kind of icon. And Bruce Lee, who was even not a Chinese. He was born in America, but somehow he came to Hong Kong. He assumed this the screen persona as a representative of the Chinese spirit, 中国的精神, and that was the moment. Hong Kong managed to manufacture a different kind of a Chinese subjectivity. And through Kung Fu Picture, Bruce Lee sort of helped circulate this Chinese sort of persona or Chinese subjectivity worldwide. And this kind of Chinese machismo, or this Chinese masculinity of a different kind, somehow becoming an incredible capital called a cultural capital or symbolic capital. And Hong Kong becomes that unlikely sort of a site producing a different kind of sort of product or commodity, put it into circulation. So how the idea of China was being packaged, being put into circulation, being projected onto all kinds of screens, sort of influences one generation of a world cinematic audience. Again, that's something we should think about. That's also kind of a win I'm talking about in today's context. And finally, in the interest of time, I will conclude with a few more examples to showcase how I try to engage this whole sort of literary polemics of Hong Kong. 1997. And this is Professor Bonnie McDougall. She wrote an essay featuring 4 writers who wrote and to testify to their understanding of history, again, with quotation marks, vis-a-vis this huge grand narrative called Handover or Return of Hong Kong, and the ending of the colonial experience or whatever. So we start with Li Bihua. This is a Mandarin Duck School writer. So it's a popular fiction, pulp fiction writer. Her fiction, from 胭脂扣 to later on to 青蛇 and so on, 霸王别姬 and so on and so forth, I thought these works are first-class writings. They really brought out that kind of mixed feelings of one generation of Sinophone Chinese readers or reviewers in the face of the impending sort of a pressure of some kind of political decision. In this particular case of 回归, the return. And the return now, however, is understood as a kind of a spectral experience, as a kind of ghostly return, right? And so the invocation of the phantom, this to use the film, the form of phantasmagoria, to take this kind of a form, to bear upon this phantom-like understanding of a 回归. So the political allegory, layers of political allegories are implicated in this novel. And the Xixi, of course, we know one of the most important women writers or writers in Hong Kong to treat Hong Kong as a floating city, right? And probably even today, this image still is occupying us. You know, the sense of uncertainty about the city with regard to history. Huang Biyun, Shi Cheng, and many other stories about either the June 4th incident and or some other traumatic consequences that befell one generation of Hong Kong youth, either on the island or in diaspora. Again, very experimental writer. And finally, Dong Qizhang, and whose atlas, 地图集, I think this is the kind of work that truly make a very good use of the fictional genre to exemplify the fiction-like quality or nature of history. And what constitutes Hong Kong? What kind of atlas we're talking about? How do we mapping or remapping Hong Kong either in spatial sense or in temporal sense? I think Dong Qizhang did a wonderful job in this particular novel. But there are many other works to talk about. So how we think of 1997, the past and the future, maybe this is a case in point. And finally, Ye Si. And I invited Professor Ray Chow of Duke University to write this particular essay. And Ray Chow, of course, was originally from Hong Kong, and she got her degree at Hong Kong U. And here, the intriguing thing is that she didn't just write an essay to commemorate Ye Si as a very refined poet. He wanted to argue that Ye Si excelled because he was able to talk about this very mixed experience of Hong Kong as a city, the so-called urban experience, in the context of poetry, and particularly lyrical poetry. Can we talk about lyricism, the lyrical dimension of Hong Kong? And here, we truly witness the most inventive aspect of Hong Kong. To conclude, I also want to argue that this project, if we take out all these names I mentioned just now, I mean, Chinese literature or the history of Chinese literature would have missed quite a bit. To say nothing of the fact that I've invited quite a number of colleagues based in Hong Kong to contribute to this volume. As I said, at least Chinese University, 中文大学, besides Professor Liu Li, and also I invited Zhang Lai, Li Zipeng, translation department or culture department, right? And he wrote about Robert Morrison. And Professor Lawrence Wang Hongzhi, he wrote about Zuo Lian, the League of Leftist Writers, and so on and so forth. And also I have Mary Wang and many other writers write about this. Above all, I invited Dong Qizhang to write about Da Tong Shu, the Book of Grand Unity. I thought that was the kind of gesture I wanted to demonstrate. Sort of in celebration of this Hong Kong or Hong Kong-based modernity in contribution to the literary history of modern China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Please be seated. Thank you once again for the enlightening lecture. Now we'll have the Q&A session, which will last around 20 minutes. Please grab the chance and feel free to ask any question. May I also invite Professor Leung to be our moderator. Please be seated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wang, for a very rich, I think, lecture. And I hope your book, the project, finished 2 months ago, and the book will be coming out in
spring of 2017.
Or 2017. So you have to wait for another 2 years until you see Hong Kong, how Hong Kong, I think, is featured, I think, in this new literary history of modern China. So we are all looking forward to buying the book and reading the book, I think. Okay, I think I won't take up too much of your time. I think we have about 20 minutes left for Q&A, and I'm sure you have questions. Make it short and brief, and then identify yourself when you raise a question, all right?
Great questions. First, I enjoyed this talk, giving us a picture of modern Chinese literature. My two questions are, first, when you mentioned the term translated modernity, my understanding sounds like it's not only a one-way translation from the West of the modernity, but a mutual, dynamic Chinese, English, Chinese, Western, Chinese, Western, a mutual translated modernity, which I would like to confirm that. And the second is that it sounds like you don't have the time to explain on the idea of the architectonics of temporalities, which is an interesting term, and I would like to hear more about that. Thank you very much.
Should I answer it? Yeah, definitely. To answer your first question very briefly, definitely a translation is a major theme of this new literary history of modern China, and definitely it's not just one-way direction or engagement. Definitely involves multiple sources and multiple trajectories, so no problem for that. To answer your second question, the architectonics of time, of course, this is jargon, actually. But anyway, what I meant is that modern experience has enabled us to think of the passage of time in a very complex manner. So I deliberately use the format of this project. Sometimes for one particular year, I feature 4 different or 5 different dates to show the prospective reader the thickness of time. And sometimes I also want to argue that time can be projected in a kind of a historical hindsight. For example, in 1971, Angel Island poetry, 天使岛, the Chinese laborers' poetry on Angel Island, the island off the shore of San Francisco, was discovered. Suddenly we realized that there's a full almost like a kind of archaeology of some lost poetic legacies, poetry composed by workers from the lower social strata in diaspora, right? And sometimes the time can be understood as a kind of mythical cycle, right? Chen Ying-ke, who died in 1969, died to bear witness to his own idea of 自由之精神, 独立之思想, the independence of the thought and the freedom of spirit. But just more than 30-some years before, he wrote the essay to commemorate Wang Guowei, using the same idea. So how, as a literary historian, using our sort of a vantage point from which to view the complexities of temporal trajectories. So that's what I meant by this kind of architectonic kind of structure of time. Of course, I have multiple sort of examples about this kind of sort of format of time and the timing.
I have a confused question which relates to your lecture that because you mentioned a lot about popular fiction or movie or songs which can be included as popular culture or mass culture, 大众文化, 通俗文化 to a certain extent. Because I come from Hong Kong Baptist University International Conference named Religion and Literature, and an idea inspired me that I will turn Chinese. 就是在明代的时候，因为以那个精英阶级为代表的雅文化和以庶民阶级为代表的俗文化，他们泾渭分明，所以在那个时候，通俗文化就有了存在的价值。它作为一种文化中层文化中间人 agency， 就是起到了一个团合社会文化的这个作用，社会文化的作用。那so my question is, in recent research, do you think the boundary between, do you think we should make an effort to confuse the boundary between popular culture and maybe pure literature, or the boundary is already fuzzy? We don't need to do that, it's old-fashioned. Or we should still treat popular culture as an individual entity to examine.
Okay, I don't think you actually have sort of answered your own question. That is, the boundary is always fuzzy, right? And but only one point I would add to your observation. That is, when we talk about popular literature, we tend to think of only the 鸳鸯蝴蝶派or 人人小cinema, Bruce Lee. That's the kind of pop culture we've been paying attention to, which has been very popular, so to speak, among students. But shall we also talk about another kind of popular culture, to take this particular word, popular, really seriously? I'm thinking of a popular culture in the revolutionary vein. During the Yan'an period, when Chairman Mao gave his Yan'an talks, he was thinking of a popular literature or culture of a different kind. So I don't want to settle for one kind of a sort of standardized definition, popular culture. So with this particular subject, I particularly highlight another kind of a so-called popular cultures. 2 examples. One is 东方红, right? starting with a Shanbei Mingge, evolved to become a 歌舞剧, huge pageant in 1965 when Dongfang Hong it really became a huge pageant. So it meant to be popular. But then the consequences of such kind of popular culture, that's kind of issue we can think of. Another example, 1958, when Chairman Mao suddenly had this wonderful idea of a caifeng, right, to collect popular poems to be composed by Chinese peasants and workers and so on. So suddenly the whole nation, everybody was writing poetry. So that's another kind of a popular culture. So maybe we want to think more diacritically when we come to a term such as popular.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for your enlightening lecture. I have two questions. The first one is, you have talked about you include Xiao Deng, Deng Lijun, in your project. And I wonder, because we know that Deng Lijun is not author of her songs, so I wonder, can we say that it's Deng Lijun's works? Because we all know her songs are written by some other lyric writers like Zhuang Nu or even Su Dongpo. And my second question is, I wonder about difference between the writing of history and writing of literary history, because you have mentioned that you invited the writer Ha Jing to write to try to reconstruct the moment that Lu Xun wrote the Diary of the Madman, but that's not I think that's not the traditional way to write history, and some literary history seems like re-evaluation of the literary works, so I wonder the boundary between those two kind of writing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. First, Xiao Deng. Exactly, that's what I meant by the multiple implications of the Chinese definition of a wen. In my original writing, of course, I try to sound very pedantic. I even referred to Wenxin Diaolong to talk about the implications of a wen, not just as a kind of semiotic, so representation of science, 就是文字, all right, but also sounding. But also 五色 and 五音, the affections, the soundings, and so on and so forth. So all these are very rich sources of a traditional understanding of wen, right? So for Deng Lijun, I know this is going to be polemical. I'm ready to be attacked by my colleagues in China. So why Deng Lijun made it into literary history? But think about her sounding. For one whole generation of PRC citizens, right after the Cultural Revolution, Deng Lijun, with her mesmerizing, sometimes a very sort of cute kind of a sound, right, sort of completely transformed the mentality, usually at night, usually with personal boombox or Walkman at that time, right, and toting, right, and this is the kind of sounding which completely rewrote the kind of so-called literary history at that time. Of course, the literature here has to be redefined in my way. So I probably wouldn't worry that much about whether Deng Lijun is the author of her own lyrics or something. Of course, she did sing Tang Shi Song Zi, but that's another matter, right? The second question, do you think if I, as a literary historian, write and rewrite the moment when Lu Xun composed 狂人日记, and therefore my account would sound more authentic than Ha Jin's fictional account of Lu Xun writing about 狂人日记? So that's a question. We have numerous writings from Wang Yao all the way, generation after generation of contemporary literary historians who wrote about Lu Xun, who wrote 狂人日记. Here, I want to argue that literary history, 文学史, all too often we tend to overlook the rich meaning of 文学的文, literary, right? So here, I wanted to bring back the imaginary dimension of 文学的文 into this new project. And I know this is unconventional, but I think Ha Jin doesn't have to be less authentic or believable as a writer writing about that moment to say nothing of the fact that Hajin did careful research and all the details in the particular essay were drawn from biographical accounts of Lu Xun's personal life.
May I just follow up this question, like for literature, I think produced by Hajin and the sort, I think in English, would you consider that part of new literary history of modern China?
English, yeah. I think this is actually this has something to do with another topic I was engaged in the other day about the Sinophone literature. Where do we draw the boundary, right? Because Hajin, exactly. Hajin probably could easily be identified as an Anglophone writer because he writes in English. But for me, however, he was sort of straddling the two linguistic zones, Chinese and English, at the same time. Two reasons. First, Hajin, of course, after 1989, decided to drop Chinese as his linguistic tool for literary creation. He felt the experience was so traumatic that he couldn't better write about his Chinese experience without referring to a new linguistic medium, in this case, English. So in that case, truly Anglophone or Sinophone became a very political kind of a choice. So Hajin probably would still argue that he is very much a Chinese writer, quotation mark. But then, of course, the language, the tool he was using is English, right? So that's probably one way to answer your question. Another thing is that many of my students and colleagues have told me that Hajin, how come his English sounds so much like Chinese? I mean, why he always use simple sentences? I mean, why his English is not so fluent actually? Why not? He's Chinese, and English is his second language. So that kind of a Chineseness, that kind of elements sort of embedded in his English rendition creates yet another sort of linguistic dynamics. It's a very peculiar moment. So I probably would argue that he may not necessarily be a Chinese language writer, but he's a Sinophone writer.
This whole book is basically about most of the historical sized moments about the modern Chinese literary history. So I want to know, because obviously you are the only one have read this whole book, then do you see any consistency in this fragmented writing of those different moments, like similarities or major features? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, because I really didn't explain my sort of editorial policy very clearly at the beginning. And indeed, at the first look, this volume may look rather scattered in terms of structure because it has so many essays, so many voices, sometimes even fictional voices, right? And so many themes and so on. But still, I have to confess, it took a lot of effort to plant a lot of clues here and there to sort of to hint at different kind of patterns. So if you will, you can really refer to Walter Benjamin's idea of a constellation, right? That you really, you look at the stars in the sky, it's really 100,000 stars, but it takes a very careful sort of eye to truly sort of to spot some kind of a format and a pattern and a configuration. So I gave the 4 general thematic directions, right? But indeed, on the other hand, I was very mindful of my colleagues, particularly my colleagues who are experts of literary history, right? And particularly, 我想我的大陆同事, my PRC colleagues, the first thing they want to check is to make sure 革命历史一定要在那里, right? So I want to make sure some kind of 革命历史 will pop up once every 10 years or every 5 years. So you name it from Li Dazhao to Red March, Long March to Yan'an. I got even 3 entries for the Yan'an period, and Chairman Mok also was being featured, then Cultural Revolutions and so forth. this being said, so still there is some kind of chronology to follow. I still want to take issue with each individual date, event, figure. I wanted to let my own perspective or voice be seen or be heard in sort of dialogue with those historical moments or figures or texts. So I definitely wanted to follow some kind of chronological or thematic lines. But as I pointed out again, for me, the contestation of a different kind of concepts and the practices of time and the dynamics of a mobility, either physical mobility or conceptual or technological mobility. I think that kind of a sense of a travel and a transculturation means a lot to me. I think that's part of our inscription of a modern experience. Thank you.
Well, time is running short, but then I think maybe we can entertain 2 more questions. And right here and the other last one, okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you for the very inspiring lecture. And I'm especially inspired by the part that you mentioned, like individuals in action, such as Ling Zhao, as some figure that show the power of writing, and also like you talk about the early like Wang Tao, because during my MPhil research in history department in COHK, I also do some research about how cities modernity influence, like Sun Zhongshan, like you talked about Hong Kong influence in Kang You-wei and the modern and what I'm wondering, because I also like work for LGBT organization now, so I'm also think of like in my point of view, I feel like this history of literature or border one it actually include the cultural modernity, not just traditional literature. But so I'm also wondering that if the sexual identity, because there's also some, I think it's a modern experience. Will that like be present in that book? Because yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, right first. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Wang. And I just want to ask a question about modernity, because as we can see that the issue of modernity has always been your constant concern. And when taking your previous works, the repressed modernity, into consideration, and you have already discussed the issue of modernity that exists, whether there are some modernities existed in the 4 main genre of literary fiction. So my question is about, in your new book, you also discussed, you find a new way to interpret it, the Chinese literary history, for the modern literature. So are there any differences between these 2 kinds of modernity? This is my question. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, don't quite get it. I mean, early on I had to...
Yeah, the new source of your modernity. Yeah. Because, connected with your, compared with your previous one.
Thank you very much. First of all, the gender, the modernity definitely is quite on my agenda. So you can be rest for sure, all right? Don't worry about it, because at least I talked about Ding Ling's coming to her gender awareness, Sophia and so on, the standard things. And I got the crystal boys there. The 聂子, Bai Xianyong, and actually it was an entry written by a director, John Weinstein, And this is a very interesting story because he at that time was a PhD student working with me, but he otherwise was already a well-established actor and stage director. In 1997, he directed Crystal Boys. He translated the whole, not really translated, he rewrote the plot of the original into an English script and directed the English stage play and featured it at Harvard. I believe Leo was there, right? We were there watching the premiere of that performance. Right, yeah. So that's kind of, I mean, I really don't feel it's necessary for me to just address the needs is very important anymore. No, I want to go further to argue that there are so many different kind of interpretations and follow-up productions, right, in light of something like needs. Another case in point is Ari Heinrich. She wrote an entry about Qiu Miaojin 的蒙马特手记 about this is of course a note of a suicide, right? And she wrote in such a way as to suggest that readers could enter her essay from whichever paragraph of personal choice. So this is almost like a composite of words and soundings and images. And it's really a very creative kind of form. So that's for your information. All right? And there are some other examples. And the final question about the modernity, I feel when I was working on repressed modernities, to be very frank, I mean, it was under the influence of a postmodernism. Although I sounded a very sort of modest on surface, trying not to make a clear reference to popular theories at the time, I mean, the anxiety of influence was there. And I just highlighted 4 patterns for modernity and so on and so forth. I hope I could have already gone beyond that stage. I mean, when you talk about modernity, it doesn't have to be reduced or compressed into, say, 3 or 4 in light of certain critical methodologies. And here I truly wanted to invoke or evoke here, instead of 4, probably 158. Different kind of voices with regard to how Chinese literary modernity came into existence. So it's that kind of sort of a textual, sometimes the medial encounter, sometimes even corporeal encounter with the challenges of different times of the modern century that inspire our writers and artists to create and generate continuously the experience of the modern. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe can I take advantage of my position being the moderator to raise one more question, I think. Like we all know, like Zhang Ailing only emerged after like Xia Ziqing's history of modern fiction to become so famous and so well known. So if your new book coming out in 2017, I think will probably, I think, if not replacing, but then will become a very important work, I think, in modern Chinese literary history. So can you identify maybe a couple of those Chinese writers, I think, who will emerge, I think, in the future generation, I think, as the most powerful, influential, but somehow right now not or commonly or recognized, I think, as major figures. Would Dong Qizhang be one? Or like that? Okay, I'll let them.
I mean, this is a kind of this is actually a very paradoxical question because, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, probably C.D. Xia's time is long gone because he demonstrated this grand narrative approach to literary history, a kind of a history that features canonical works or authenticate writers who otherwise would have been obscured by readers of the past or bygone ages, to identify those unknown names, to pin down some specific moments, and so forth. The nature of the new project is such. I got so many different essays, each is only about 2,000 words in length. It's probably difficult to really erect any particular canon or canonical writer or voices anymore. But still, the question does make important sense to me. I was mindful of introducing new names. For example, Hei Ying. When I come to the subject of 新感觉派, new sensationalism, I mean, I've got Liu Nao, I've got Shi Zhecun, and so forth. But Hei Ying, I mean, probably most of my audience, I'm a guest of my audience, probably don't know who he is. But actually, this is a guy from Indonesia. He traveled all the way to Shanghai, and he's a musician in the first place. And then he created writings which are just as intriguing as those well-known names of 新感觉派. So in that sense, I feel among the choices I had, I decided to really highlight some lesser-known writers. And another case in point probably is a Taiwanese writer, Wu He, Dancing Crane. And he wrote a novel about the Taya Aboriginal riot in 1930. And Wu He is a Han Taiwanese writer. And I feel when we come to this kind of so-called minority writings, in a way we can do something very political, correct sort of endeavor to invite an Aboriginal writer to write about Aboriginal experience. That's streamline the so-called primitive passions and so on and so forth. No, I didn't do that. I wanted to have someone like Wu He, a very creative writer, who wrote about his encounter with the Aboriginal tribe and coming to realize his own inadequacy of articulating such a kind of traumatic experience of the Aboriginal tribes. So I thought that's another example probably for everyone's attention. Finally, I featured Zhang Chengzhi. Of course, he's a known writer, well-known Muslim writer, not really Muslim. He's a Han Chinese writer, but he wanted to call him 最后的穆斯林 or something like that. I invited him to contribute one essay to this volume. And he wrote one for me. And it's a beautiful essay, sort of elegy in commemoration of a great Muslim writer who died recently in some holy war or battle. I was confused by the person he wrote about. And I thought this essay is so beautiful. But who this guy was, who was being killed and so on and so forth. It's a very sad essay. I wrote back to him. I said, Mr. Zhang, could you tell me a little more about this figure you wrote about? And he wrote back, actually a little bit agitated, upset. He said, you should read, and you should know who this guy was. If you couldn't recognize this person, so be it. I withdraw my essay. So I got nervous. I thought, wow, this is something very important. So I followed the dates he gave me, the entry. Each entry started with a date. And I did my survey, Google and everything. And I came to realize that the 2011 May, that particular period date, only one person could fulfill the description of that particular elegiac essay. Guess who? Osama bin Laden. So you asked me, you put me in I mean, that really was a kind of political and a moral dilemma now for me. Doing an anthology in America, and I've invited a strong writer to write something, and yet he shocked me with some kind of unexpected subject matter. But on surface, you couldn't tell who he was writing about. So should I include that essay or not? That became an existential question.
So you're not doing a survey of opinions, right? Okay, I think this is a very rich, lecture. I think only a glimpse or into the keyhole into his panoramic view until you open the door, and then you will be fascinated, I think, by all these rich, descriptions and sceneries. So I hope, like me, you all are waiting for the book to come out in 2017. So before that, I think you read maybe pieces here and there, and then I hope you will be benefited, I think, by the insights and all the stories of today. Okay, let us thank Professor Wang once again.
Thank you, Professor Wang and Professor Leung. Please be seated. May I now invite Professor Fok Tai Fai, our PVC, to present a souvenir to Professor David Wang. Professor Fok and Professor Wang, please. Professor Fok and Professor Wang, please stay. May I invite Professor Leung to join the photo taking. Now may I invite all guests to come out for group photos.